thinks of the history of Iran, there are three different ideas that come to mind. One is that Iran is a people, the Iranians. They have a long history, and you can follow that history through many different sources. Then there is the idea of Iran as a place. This is particularly conspicuous today when we have national boundaries, but national boundaries are of quite recent vintage, beyond the period of these talks I'll be giving. Then there's Iran as a culture. I would say that for most Iranians that I know, and for probably most historians of Iran that I'm acquainted with, Iran as a culture is the most riveting focus, an interest in a succession of kings on the one hand, and in a great literature, particularly a poetic literature, on the other hand, leading to the idea that if you read the literary sources of all sorts, you will have a sense of what Iran is and was. But I'm going to concentrate on the first two topics, Iran as a people and Iran as a place. Now, Iran as a people gets involved in the question of language because we don't know much about the demographics or the actual movements of the earliest Iranian peoples. But we do know that they had a language that had various dialects, obviously, and that language included the concept of the Aryans, and that Iran is related to the word Aryan. The language that we have that is the most, appears to be the earliest, is that preserved in parts of the Avestan, the holy book of the Zoroastrians. But it is a language that is almost indistinguishable from the language of the Rig Veda, which is a holy book of the Hindus. There are certain changes, sound changes, particularly from an S's to H's, but by and large, Avestan and Vedic are the same language. And therefore, linguistic historians talk about the Indo-Iranian people as a branch of an Indo-European mega family of languages. And the Indo-Iranian people and their language have sparked many, many, many investigations of where that language was first spoken. The language is conceived of as Proto-Indo-European, and the search for the Proto-Indo-Europeans tends to focus on areas in the north, from the Black Sea, northern Black Sea plain across to the areas north of Afghanistan. Today, if you are in Indian historical studies, you are aware of a very intense debate over precisely the question of who were the Aryans. If you are in Iranian history, the question of who are the Aryans almost never gets talked about, at least not in the same sense that it is in India. In India, there is a school of thought that maintains that European and American scholars have created a kind of a myth of a northern people who come down into India and create the civilization of Vedic India. And that movement of the Aryans into Northwest India is portrayed as being analogous to later historical movements of Muslim rulers, particularly Turks and Persians, into India in the period of the Delhi Sultanate, and modern movements of British and other European exploiters into India during the period of imperialism and colonialism. And this is portrayed as a kind of conspiracy to reduce the native Indian population to being subjects, to being people who are continually looking to foreign masters to define their culture, to define who they are. And this has understandably stirred up a tremendous amount of resentment among scholars and ordinary people who don't like the idea of being portrayed as passive in history. And therefore, you have a counter argument that is made and elaborated upon in quite some detail that maintains that the Aryans originated in India and spread from India to Iran, to Central Asia, to other parts of the world. And that India is, in fact, in its native and indigenous population, the creator of Indo-European civilization. This debate is quite central to current politics in India and to the increasing tensions there between Hindus and Muslims. In Iran, nobody cares or has heard about this debate unless they happen to follow Indian affairs. I don't know of any historian or author who has made a case with respect to Iran that Iran is the beneficiary of Indian culture, that the culture of the Aryans who moved into Iran came from India, from the southeast, rather than from the northeast. Now, the reason for this, I mean, these are neighboring countries. It's the same language, the same people. And yet, in one case, the question of where they came from is a gripping historical debate and political debate. In the other case, it's taken for granted that everyone agrees that the Aryans came down from the north and that there is no special pleading on behalf of the indigenous populations that were whose territory was taken over by the Iranians as they came in. And I think the reason for this is because there weren't many Iranians who were, let me put it differently, there weren't many people before the Iranians in the geography that we think of today as Iran. When you look at, if you go back to say 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago, and you look at the locations where you have archaeological investigations that have uncovered early cultures, you'll find these are mostly in highland areas in the north and northwest, and very little in the central plateau of Iran or in the south. And I think that that's largely because the central plateau and the southern areas extending over into western Pakistan, I think they had very, very sparse populations. So in the same way that you have no politicization over the question of whether the Irish are the interlopers who cross the English Channel and cross the Irish Sea and then settle in Ireland, and that you have some sort of suppressed indigenous population that now should have some political consciousness. You don't have that debate in Ireland or in Norway or elsewhere. And it's generally thought by historians and archaeologists that a large reason for this is that the disproportion in population size was so substantial that the people coming in more or less absorbed the indigenous populations without leaving much of a trace, although the different dialects of the Iranian languages that get spoken doubtless have some input from the indigenous populations who were already there. So the Iranians are a population that come down from the north. From their earliest religious texts, we can see that they herded cattle and to some degree were a migratory population, in the sense that we don't have, for the earliest period, much in the way of cities or extensive agricultural territories. And we have in the holy book, the Avesta, the description of a culture that puts enormous amount of value on owning cattle and seems to look upon stealing other people's cattle as being part of the life they lived, whereas you don't have much of an emphasis upon growing crops. People who look at the Indo-European expansion and from the Proto-Indo-European homeland, if it was in the north, see this as a general phenomenon where you had a mobile population that spreads as far east as the gateways of China, as far west as Ireland, as far north as Sweden, and that everywhere they went, they had a certain focus on cattle, less of a interest in extensive farming. Let me turn to the question of the land. Today, we often think of Iran simply as within its borders. But when you're thinking of these early populations that we identify as speakers of Iranian languages, you have to take into account that they occupy at least 4 different geographies. There are geographies in which there are large river valleys that have elaborate agricultural systems that were there before the Iranians came. One of them, and the one that's in debate in India, is the Indus Valley in Pakistan. But on the western side of Iran today, you have the Tigris and Euphrates Valley in Mesopotamia. The history of agricultural expansion by indigenous peoples in those areas, the Indus Valley civilization on the one hand, and the Babylonian, Akkadia, or Assyria, the southern and the west of the northern parts of Iraq, on the other hand, all of that was pre-Iranian. And so the Iranians move in, become powerful in both areas. You have a very elaborate history in those areas. But one is on the far west, one's on the far east. So what do you have in the middle? Because they're coming down from the northeast, from the north. And there you have 3 different situations. You have one in which the center of the country is made up of high mountains, and that's Afghanistan. The high mountains of Afghanistan receive a great deal of rainfall. The rain and snow flow out of the mountains into rivers that go in all directions from Afghanistan. The rivers to the east go into the Indus Valley. The rivers from the southwest go into the Helmand River, which disappears in eastern Iran, southeastern Iran. And to the north, you have the rivers that flow into what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, where you have large rivers, even if their flow varies a great deal from winter to summer. Where you have large rivers, you have the potential of substantial agricultural development. That's geographically extensive. So the northern areas in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan develop into a culture based on irrigation from these rivers. That's the culture of Bactria in northern Afghanistan and the culture of Sogdia farther north in the area of Bukhara and Samarkand in Uzbekistan. The alternative to this is what you have in what we now think of as Iran as the current geography. As in Afghanistan, the center of the country has a low population, almost zero, but not because it's high mountains, but because it has no water. In the center of Afghanistan, you have high mountains that impede communication, and you have river valleys that tend to focus population in specific points around the mountains. But in Iran, you have deserts in the center, particularly in the center and to the south and southeast. And those deserts equally inhibit transportation and have very low populations. In a sense, when you talk about the land of Iran, you have 3 different lands of Iran. You have an Afghanistan-centered land that is broken up geographically. So you go around the mountains, but you rarely go through the mountains. Then you have river valleys in the north the Oxus River, the Jaxartes, and there you have kind of a smaller version of Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley area. But then in Iran, what we call the Iranian plateau, this high but dry center of the today's nation of Iran, you have no outlets to the ocean, and there's no water to flow into the outlets because Iran is in what is called a rain shadow, meaning that as moist winds move toward Iran from the west and from the north, the high mountains along the southern edge of the Caspian Sea and the high mountains on the western borderlands of Iran, between Iran and Iraq, they cause the moist air to go up. As it goes up, you get precipitation, and so you get a great deal of rainfall in the Zagros Mountains to the west, and in the Elburz Mountains in the north, with their extension eastward in the Binalud Mountains. These areas where a great deal of rain falls pretty much dry out the air, so that when you get over the mountains, you suddenly have desert. So that if you were to drive from Tehran, which is in a desert, to the Caspian shore, even though as the crow flies, it's not a very great distance. As you wind up the mountains on the southern side, there's virtually no water, and you are seeing a desert landscape. But once you cross the crest of the mountains, you are suddenly descending into the coastal plain of the Caspian Sea, and you're in a semi-tropical sort of environment with a great deal of water, greenery, houses built on stilts to keep from flooding. And you can see that if it were not for the mountains, all that rain and snow that falls on those mountains would be flowing into the center of Iran. And yet even there's no outlet to the sea in any direction, so that the water would simply flow into the center of Iran. And during very hot summers, it would evaporate. And as it evaporates, the water vapor goes into the atmosphere, but the water vapor, the water that has been underground and has dissolved various salts from the soil, leaves those salts behind. So you have huge extents of the internal plateau of Iran that are either heavy plates of salt or at least very salty soil. And this salty soil cannot be cultivated under most circumstances, though you do have certain plants that are more friendly to salt than others. And for some grazing animals, camels in particular, salty plants are not unattractive. There are periods when the animals want the salt. So it's not only a desert, but it's in many areas extensive tracts of land that are salt deserts. You have a parallel of this in Death Valley in the United States and California, but it's comparatively rare, for example, in the Sahara Desert or in Arabia, two other great deserts that do not, by and large, have huge areas of salt because they are not receiving large amounts of underground water. It's the underground water that then percolates to the surface under the heat of the sun and turns into water vapor and leaves the salt behind. That's sort of the specialty of Iran. You do get a parallel to it in Turkey, where you have a central plateau that is similar to that of Iran. But in the Turkish case, it's a much, much smaller central area, and around it are areas, all of which have pretty easy connection to river valleys flowing into the Aegean Sea to the west, or the Black Sea to the north, or into the Tigris and Euphrates valleys to the south. So you get easier communication from the edges of the central Turkish plateau, the Anatolian plateau, easier connections with the exterior areas than you have in Iran, because In Iran, the Alborz Mountains to the north flow into the Caspian Sea. Caspian Sea, you can't settle the Caspian Sea, it's a body of water. The mountains to the west flow into the Tigris River, but Tigris River is heavily populated area by indigenous populations. There are no rivers flowing east from Iran, but you do have some rivers flowing into Iran from the east, from Afghanistan, particularly the Helmand River in the southeast, and the Hari Rud, the river that provides water for the city of Herat in western Afghanistan. But otherwise, you don't have much water flowing into Iran from the east. And in the south, there are no river valleys. There's no water flow. There's no water at all. So that the southern coast of Iran, the Makran coast, is astonishingly barren over much of its extent. In looking at the history of Iran as a geographical concept, many scholars, I think, have thought of it to try to make a distinction between Iran as a much larger area, the area where the Indo-Aryans settled, and Persia being closer to the geographical definition of the current state of Iran. And so you have a confusion of terminology, where someone will think of a greater Iran or a more extensive Iran, and someone else will say, well, let's call one Iran and the other Persia. But I think that the terminology is less important than the geography. If you're thinking, and I'm going to focus more than anything on the central geographical, the geography of the Iranian state as it exists today, and particularly on the question of what happens on the periphery of the central plateau, the central deserts of Iran. The overlap between this geography and the population is not a clear-cut given. If you go back to the earliest evidence of different peoples in the Iranian group who are living in or around this central area, you look at the carvings at Persepolis showing different delegations coming from different parts of the realm ruled by the Shahs of the Achaemenid family. And those peoples are coming from different provincial areas, but they have a certain sameness to them, with the exception of a delegation of Arabs and one or two others. They are all considered to be Iranians. Whether there were native populations that were extensive is very hard to tell in most parts of Iran, but in the southwest, in the province of Fars, you did have a population from ancient times known as the Elamites, and the Elamites later become called the Huzi, and therefore this province called Khuzestan. And in still later times, they become, many of them become Arabic speakers. The sequence of population settlements in Fars, in this southwestern area, is complicated, but it doesn't appear to have much carryover into the other parts of Iran, to the north and the east and the south of Fars province. Did the people in Iran, in this geographical entity focused on the central plateau, or defocused from the central plateau, did they speak Iranian languages? We can't tell the extent to which they did, but we don't see much evidence of other languages. Elamite is a known language, and you have one or two archaeological sites to the east of Fars province where inscriptions have been found that are considered to be Proto-Elamite, traces of perhaps commerce between the Indus Valley and the Fars province, and people speaking languages related to Elamite, which is not an Indo-Iranian language, who lived in that area. But for other parts of Iran, we don't have other languages to consider. And I think that's because the the disproportion between the population sizes, plus perhaps the fact that to have traces of language, you have to have had some sort of written culture, which may not have existed. So when you think of Iran in 500 BC, 2,500 years ago, when you have the beginning of the empire of the Achaemenid Shahs, you probably should be thinking of the plateau periphery as primarily speaking Iranian languages. In other words, this is sort of an Iran area for the substantial majority of the population. But you move on to somewhat later times, and other languages come into Iran and other peoples, so that at a certain point, that I'll get into it a later lecture, you have Arabs coming into Iran from the west and staying there. At a still later point, you have Turkic peoples coming into Iran from the northeast and to some degree from the northwest, and they settle the areas where they occupy. And often then you will get areas that are, let us say, will speak Persian, but read and write Arabic, or speak Turkic and read and write Persian, or at different periods of time. Today, somewhat less than half the population of the Islamic Republic of Iran are native speakers of Persian. And you have very large populations that speak Turkic languages, particularly in the Northwest. But all these people, to some degree, think of themselves as part of an Iranian culture. So that over time, the notion of Iran as a people becomes overlain by the notion of Iran as a culture. And once Iran comes to be thought of as a cultural tradition, then the question of what language is spoken becomes less central. So it's the reason why when you try and think of history of Iran as a history of a people, it begins to unravel, because so many of the people who live in Iran, have lived in Iran, are native speakers of a non-Iranian language, think of themselves as part of the cultural tradition. So there is an evolution from a people into a culture that undercuts the notion that the people is defined by a common language or a common group of languages. So the geography remains constant, but the population changes. Over time, the changes in the geography will come about in some cases because of changes in climate. But the most important changes that you have before that time are changes in the utilization of water. And from my perspective, the discovery of and the exploitation of underground water resources has a transformative impact upon Iranian history, regardless of whether you think of it as a history of a people, a history of a culture, or the history of an area of land. And that exploitation of underground water resources, even though it probably begins at least 2,000 years ago, it doesn't become extensive until maybe 1,500 years ago. And the growth of that use of underground water falls into the area of technological history and the place where technology overlaps economics. The economy of ancient lands is often affected by the nature of the polity, the nature of the government, and the nature of the communication system. But both of them are based on an infrastructure of geography, so that if you have a group of smaller rivers with small plains where you can have agriculture, you might have an agricultural area and then travel over perhaps some very hilly ground to get to the next little river valley. If you look into the southern edges of Turkmenistan, which borders Iran on the northeast, you see little river valleys flowing out of the Binalud Mountains, flowing northward. And you do have archaeologically small cultivated areas and small principalities of some sort in that area of southern Turkmenistan. That water that flows to the south instead of to the north flows into a river that then flows west into the Caspian Sea. And south of that, there's no river flowing on a permanent basis south into the Iranian plateau. The geography, when you have small rivers, is often to have small principalities that are divided by hilly country that's fairly difficult to traverse. You don't have easy communication from one area to the next. So when you look at, say, the central plateau of Turkey, central Anatolia, it's surrounded in antiquity by small cultures that speak different languages, different capital cities, Lydia and Phrygia and so forth. In Afghanistan, you have something the same. You have different societies developing in the river areas that flow out of the mountains. But in Iran, the center really doesn't provide any way of sustaining agriculture on a regular rainfall basis. And the result is that Iran, I think, always had before, let us say, 600 AD. I think the center of Iran, I think Iran had a fairly sparse population, and it was centered in mountain valleys where you could have crops that are grown. And those crops would provide food. And primarily, the staple foods would be grains, wheat and barley. These would be crops that would be planted in the fall, and they would begin to push out of the ground in the spring, in March or April. This is what we would call winter wheat in this country. It's commemorated in the Iranian religious cultural tradition by the notion that the new year, March 21st, Nowruz, will be marked by 7 green things. And one of them is sprouted wheat, because that is when you see the crops beginning to come out of the ground. And this is very different from, let us say, a pattern we see in many parts of the United States, where you plant crops in the spring and you harvest them in the fall. This is a matter of planting in the fall and harvesting in the spring, because the summer is so hot and so dry that unless you are bringing water in artificially for garden crops, you can't have large areas of crops. So that the economy of Iran in the 2,000 years ago was based on grain farming in fairly localized areas. The grain farming could, in some areas, support a city, and a regime could mobilize military power, and tended to rely on a peasantry for work in the fields. But it was a very poor source for unified or imperial military power, unlike the military power that could develop in northern Iraq with the Assyrians, or in southern Iraq with the Babylonians and other rulers down there. So Iran was not a military, could not muster a massive military force in the way that people in Mesopotamia could. It grew wheat and barley, and it mined metals, which are very rich ores in the mountains of Iran. But moving wheat and barley across country is very expensive. The weight it doesn't pay to move more than 100 miles or so if you're carrying food. And carrying metal, particularly metal that has not yet been processed across country, is very heavy and difficult. So that Iran did not have much in the way of products to export. It moved things in shorter jumps from place to place. The exception was that from second or third century before the Common Era, if not earlier, you did have a trade route that developed across northern Iran that went out into Central Asia and all the way to China, and would move across northern Iran westward to the Zagros Mountains, cross those mountains in the area of the city of Hamadan, and then it would be in Mesopotamia, and the products of the trade route could move westward toward the Mediterranean Sea, crossing into, say, Roman territory around the city of Dura Europos, or it could move southwestward into deeper Mesopotamia with Babylon and other cities in the south, the objects. So you had a route from China to Mesopotamia that's called the Silk Road. It's called the Silk Road because at some point, silk was the highest value, most easily transported product. But Iran was not producing the silk. Ultimately, does become a silk producer, but not initially. And the consequence is Iran doesn't have a substantial place in an international economic construct. It's not a productive area, except on a local basis. Once water is managed for the growth of crops of different sorts, a process which we shall see also facilitates transportation, then Iran becomes a completely different economy, a completely different place. But I will take up that question in my next talk. Thank you very much.